Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll be getting started in just a minute or two as more people join. Hey, everyone. For those who are entering the webinar, we'll be getting started in just a moment. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Inside the ACT Changes, Preparing Students for the New Format. My name is Jordan Friedman, and I'm a director here at MasteryPrep. We're excited to have you all join us and to get started. For those of you who aren't familiar with MasteryPrep, we're a company offering a standards-aligned system to prepare students for state-required assessments that are a part of accountability models. Presenting today will be Craig Gehring, our founder and CEO, and Oliver Pope, our chief product officer. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions for Craig and Oliver, please be sure to put those in the chat, and we'll spend a few minutes answering questions toward the end of the webinar. And now I'm excited to pass it off to Craig and Oliver, who will introduce themselves and get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Craig Gehring. I'm the founder and the CEO of MasteryPrep, as Jordan shared just a second ago, and really excited to be working with you on this webinar and looking forward to answering any question that you have about the enhancements to the ACT.
And I'm Oliver Pope. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at MasterPrep. So I'm in charge of all the products that we develop, all the curriculum we create, and everything that we do for the platform in terms of the content and lessons. And I will be talking a lot about the ACT today. So hopefully we're all ready to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. And Craig, I'm going to open up with just a quick overview of the game plan for today's webinar. So we've got an hour selected. There'll definitely be some time for some questions. So if you are at any point during the webinar have a question that pops up, please jump into the chat, drop it into the chat as a question. Jordan here is going to be monitoring and collecting questions for us for the end of the session. And it'll be just a private message that we'll see, so you don't have to worry about everyone seeing your questions to each other. So no question is inappropriate. Just ask us. We love to address that at the end. But for today, we're going to be running through the changes in the ACT, some of the misconceptions you're going to see out there, or maybe even you have regarding the ACT, or people you work with, or even your own students. We're going to talk about our recommendations on how you should approach it. Some of the things that we do at Mastery Prep in terms of like our strategies and how we're approaching this new change. And then, like I said, we'll have a time at the end for some question and answering. So without further ado, let's jump in. And I think the first thing I want to hit really hard is when the changes take effect. So this is a pretty important topic. It fits directly into the implementation plans you're going to be bringing into your schools and your communication strategy. And it's something that we put a lot of energy into at Mastery Prep. Craig, I'm curious if you want to have anything you want to say about this in terms of like where we want to be focusing. It's kind of a nuanced topic with the tests changing over the summer and then over the spring. So what are your thoughts on the changing in the timeline?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaways are one, students can access on national test days, they can access the enhanced version of the ACT now. But for school day testing and everything, all the calendars kind of work backwards from school day testing, uh, is the first school day testing administration is going to be happening in the spring of 2026. And so what that means is that all, and we're big advocates of starting early. We'll talk about that later in the webinar. But because the test is in the new version in the spring of 2026, that means all of your preparation through, starting with the start of this upcoming school year, the 25-26 school year, needs to be in alignment with that new form of the test. So you can access the enhanced ACT now. For national test takers, you see that asterisk on the slide. You know, there'll be a point where you can no longer access the former version of the ACT in September, where just every national tester is taking it, you know, buying the test directly from ACT and taking it on a Saturday, for example. They'll be experiencing that enhanced ACT only and these changes that we're talking about. But in terms of a school district preparing students for the school day testing, again, spring 2026 is the first time students are going to be experiencing that in the school day. And
Yeah.
want to say, just, you know, want to make a big note here is that ACT.org has all of the scoop about this. They obviously have the most up-to-date information about how this is rolling out. So strongly recommend that you stay tuned to the official ACT site and use that as your primary reference for what's happening.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Craig. And I think that, you can even go on ac.org and you can see practice tests right now in the new format. So there's a lot of really great resources there. And one thing I want to punch out that, Craig hit on this, but I think it's an important theme. Part of the purpose of even this webinar is when we're talking to educators and we're talking to districts, we're finding a lot of schools out there they're thinking spring 2026 is really far away. But as Craig emphasized, really it's summertime whenever you need to be thinking about this, like this summer, because this is going to be affecting your implementation, your scope and sequence, all of those components. And so we'll talk about that later on. But I want to emphasize that you see 2026, it feels like it's like the future. There's like going to be robots and things, but it's coming around the corner. Like it's on our radar.
And Rodney
So
just asked a question in the chat that I think it's timely to address here. He said our state does a fall assessment in 2025 for seniors. Will it be the new form? No. So unless something changes, again, refer to ACT.org. School day testing, district testing does not change until spring of 2026. So if you're doing a school day testing in 2025, then it's going to be on the former version of the ACT, not the enhanced version.
yeah, and I just the one wrinkle there, Rodney, and anyone else listening too, is it. I know that some schools will send their students to the national test date on a Saturday. That's where the wrinkle is. So if you aren't sure, feel free to let us know more details if this is going to be in school versus a Saturday testing, and if it's going to be like when in the fall, if it's September versus August. Actually, I don't know if there's an August date anymore, but September date. Like, just let us know some details and we can give you the straight answer on that. But that's a very good point Craig brings up. School day testing has not changed till the spring. So if you're, a March or April or something like that, you're going to be you're going to see it then. So let's talk a bit about the changes themselves, because I think one of the biggest topics is, we have the test is changing, and especially if this is still something you're getting a grip on, that can come across as like a pretty scary thing. And we wanted to talk about some of the changes, some of the upsides you're going to see, and then how that's going to affect how you bring it into the classroom. And the first thing I wanted to really emphasize is the question count. So ACT has been making a very concerted effort to make this test more accessible and provide more choice to schools and districts and just individual students. One of the changes that we've seen is there's been a reduction in the length of the exam overall in terms of like the number of questions. This has been a pretty concerted thing. It affects pretty much every section. It affects the math, English, and the reading sections. And you're going to see some pretty big changes. And we'll talk more about them in a minute. But net result is students are going to see fewer questions. And that's if they've taken the choice to include the science. So if the science is being a choice-based section now, if students opt to or decide the science is not appropriate for their application, or either way, it's something that as a district or a school, you haven't selected it, the test even goes even shorter. And so that's one of the big changes. So Craig, I'm kind of curious if you wanted to add any color commentary on item count.
Yeah, I think overall, and you'll see, we'll talk about this too, like the fact that there are fewer questions, uh, subjectively might make the test feel more approachable for students. It also means that every question counts a little more, right? And so you have this, so it giveth and it taketh away, right? Like there's a balance there that means that students have to change a little about how they address the test to be able to get the outcome that they want.
Yeah, and I think that's a subtle difference of like, accessibility in terms of the length of the exam so that we can get it into the school day. And that isn't necessarily, those are good things that the AC is pushing, but it does not mean the test is easier or harder or any of those kinds of changes. We'll talk more about that. That's a really good clarifying point. One of the other changes that we wanted to highlight is the way the time is being distributed across the questions. ACT is taking a different approach with how they're structuring the time on the exam. And so there's the devil's in the details. You have to look at individual sections, individual questions. But the net result is we have a roughly 18% bump in the time that students get per question, which is, again, a really huge change to the test that affects strategy. It affects a lot of different like downstream things, which we'll discuss when we get into the section specific pieces. And again, Craig,
I'm
I'm
sure you
curious
can.
your take on.
Well, I'm sure you can think of the straight A student who comes out of the ACT test saying, I ran out of time. I cannot finish in enough time. And again, at first blush, just having more time per question means that you're going to have some students who that isn't their main problem anymore, right? But with a lot of students, just because they have more time doesn't necessarily make them better time managers, right? Some students will run out of time no matter how much time you give them, and other students will just not really know what to do with the time to be productive, right? And so, again, it takes working with the students and helping them develop the proper habits around the test in order for them to really gain the benefit of that increased time per question.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out too, from a time management pacing approach, 18% is definitely like a room for to give the students room to breathe, but it isn't a radical game changer. It's still really easy to waste time. It's still really easy to overcommit to a question, to a passage, and so uh, you definitely don't want to interpret this as like some of the other exams out there that are untimed or have a generous amount of time. It's still going to be an obstacle to manage. But to your point, Craig, what you're going to see is like it's going to be on the margins. You're going to have students who are able to have a little bit more breathing time. They have a bit more room to do strategy, a bit more room to fact check and be careful and be more accurate. And that's where really, one of the things that we're going to be focusing on with some of these sections. Uh, so yeah, so let's talk a bit further about these changes, and I wanted to get in a little bit into the weeds on this, and I apologize if you're not a super knowledgeable about the current state of the ACT. We're going to talk about some of the details here, but this is really good information to share out with your team. And if you are an ACT nerd like I am, like you're going to find this really fascinating. The first thing I wanted to talk about is passages. So this is a big initiative that you're going to see on the enhanced ACT. Both the English section and the reading section had a concerted effort to shorten the length of the passages. So here's a couple examples. An old passage, or what we would call like from the legacy version of the ACT, and a variation of that passage with edits in line with the new exam. And so what you're seeing is like roughly an 850 word count passage for reading reduced to about 650. That's about the change that we're seeing. Which if you worked with students on the reading test, you would know completing the test and reading through the passage is one of the more challenging things to do. This allows students to dig in a little bit deeper into the passage, and we'll talk how that affects strategy. But that's a really big change to the reading. A couple other changes that are worth highlighting is that we already mentioned this, but the science is now going to be a choice. So I want to talk about that, Craig, because it's a little misleading, but I think, I'm curious your take on the idea of like science is choice doesn't necessarily mean it's always really a choice, right?
Yeah, I mean, on the national test date, there's if a student is signing up with ACT, then obviously that individual student has the choice to either take the ACT with or without science. Um, and taking the science test is a signal to colleges and gives a science related STEM score, right? And a science score that colleges can use to evaluate you, right? So if you are, even though it's a choice, if you have any interest in STEM, I would strongly recommend taking the science test. Regardless, and we'll probably talk about this in more detail, regardless of whether you take the science or not, you get a composite score from English, math, and reading, right? So there really isn't a huge, a downside to taking science. In general, we recommend you taking it. But at the state level, if you have the state paying for your test, then largely the state is going to be deciding whether or not science is included, right? So it's a state choice. But then once that choice is made, then the districts, the schools, they're going to be following suit with that. So, and we're monitoring this, but some states are going to decide to keep science in there, particularly if it factors into their accountability models and assessment models. And then some states are going to choose to have the ACT go without science. And so you'll know that long before your test day. But yeah, you're right, Oliver. It's an important distinction for sure.
Yeah, I think and I think want to just boil that back down to like you need to get your plan in place early. Like we don't want to wait until we're several months out to suddenly realize the science is really important because it's been selected. But I think that's my main emphasis there is just understanding, are you doing it or not? Is it valuable to your students because they've been selected as a state test or they've opted to go STEM and they're taking it on a Saturday? Once you know that knowledge, then you determine your strategy around it. But it is a change. It's similar to if you're familiar with the writing section of the ACT, where that's again a choice section. It gets its own unique score now, but some colleges are going to be interested in that for the opposite reason why they would like science. The other thing I wanted to talk about is field test items. This is a pretty big change from how ACT approaches structuring its tests. So if you're familiar, the ACT does do field testing, which this means that it's asking questions to students that are not scored, they're not a part of the score. There's been a field testing effort in the ACT for a while. It's the mysterious Section 5. If you've ever heard of that, it pops up, students answer questions, and their performance on those questions gives data to ACT to calibrate the rest of the other questions because this is a norm reference test. So that's the way that they've done in the past. That's a change. Instead of having a fifth section, and again, kind of in the spirit of shortening the length of the test, making it a more accessible experience, the field test questions are going to be integrated into the test. So what that means is if you're doing the English test, for example, a portion of those questions will be unscored. So the students won't know that they're field tests. They'll be intermixed in a way that they can't determine or make any educated guesses about what's field test. But what'll happen is they won't count as a raw point. And there's some consequences for that when it comes to strategy. It does create some changes around how you communicate around scores. Uh, for example, and Craig, I'm curious your take on this. Even how much you communicate to students about this can be tricky because if you tell students, "Hey, there's some questions that aren't scored," like you don't want to get in their head, right? Like, you agree with that, Craig?
Yeah, I think that in general, uh, it's best if the student takes it without knowing that there are some unscored items. It's not the knowledge of it only, I mean, and some students are going to find out about this if they are ACT nerds themselves and they're digging into it, but really the knowledge of it doesn't help, can only hurt, right? It doesn't impact strategy in any way whatsoever. Um, Overall, it is a extension of ACT's commitment to quality, right? The fact that field test items are integrated means that they're more meaningful, and can help drive improvements to the exam. It also means that they're sampling school day testing much more heavily, which means that they have more data on the quality of the exam as it relates to students taking it in a school day context. So these are very positive moves toward and in alignment with ACT's commitment to fairness in exams. So, we at MasteryPrep, we think this is a huge positive. But the mechanism where it's done is exactly like Oliver says. Like they have to take somewhere in that test is the field test items in each of the sections, and it's best to just pretend like they're not there and just take the whole test like it's all scored.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that, and I can speak from my experience, I've worked in the past with tests that are like this, like the GMAT, which is the test you take to get your MBA. That is the method they use. And I've worked with adults, MBA candidates who are a special breed of person that were trying to, do the best they could to figure out what was field test. And they would always try to guess at it. never successfully. I have an extremely high score in the GMAT, and I can't tell what's a field test question. That's the design of the questions. And so students should not, if you find students chitter chattering around, well, I read on Reddit that if a question is suddenly very easy, that must mean it's field test or something. That's really not true. So we want them to like stay out of getting into that realm. So that said, that's a good transition to our next topic, because we wanted to talk about some of the common misconceptions with the ACT. So there's a lot of misconceptions. In fact, the field test one isn't even on our list. It just kind of, something that jumped to mind. And what we wanted to do is equip you with the ability to talk about this with your students or with your teachers or colleagues or administration if you are a teacher, uh, and just dispel some myths, even maybe that you have your own myths. And so the first one I wanted to talk about is the content of the test is radically different. So you'll notice that when we were talking about the ACT changes, we were talking about the amount of items, we were talking about the length of the passages, we were talking about the amount of time spent. One thing we didn't talk about as a change is the content alignment that's in the test. So we're talking about like the college and career readiness standards. So there was, initially when it was all happening, some chatter out in the world that we may see some standards disappear, introduction of standards. But the reality is that it hasn't changed. The test covers the same standards that you've seen. So if you're familiar with the college or career readiness standards, or if you're familiar with the reporting categories, however you like to think about the ACT, all of the same standards are there. The big change that they've done to the content is there's been some changing in the proportionality of what's on the test. So certain standards are de-emphasized a little bit, certain ones are emphasized a bit more. The kind of a rebalancing that's happened, but you're not going to see anything like totally disappear or any new things added. So no calculus is on the ACT. We're still going to see trigonometry. Like all of that's going to be the same. So let's talk about the next one, which is the math questions are the easy ones are gone. So let's talk about where that misconception comes from. So Craig, talk about the math structure changes. What's changed to the math test?
Well, a good orientation point is the current or former version of the test, right? So in math, there is as a trend, there's a gradual increase in difficulty from the beginning of the test to the end of the test, right? If you sample one random question in the back 10, it's going to be much harder on average than one random question in the front 10 of the math test. And so that's a structural element to the test that is not going away. And I think there was some just chatter among educators that maybe it would be the front uh, chunk of the test. The way they're getting rid of reducing the number of questions is just cutting off the front part of the test. So you're sort of just jumping in into the middle and higher difficulty questions, and that's just not the case. So, but that was sort of the and I've heard it a few times. That's just sort of the start of the rumor there. There's still going to be kind of a similar sort of curve of difficulty, but the quote unquote easier questionnaires are the questions that are associated with the lowered numbered college readiness standards are still quite present in the math exam.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that goes into, one of the ways that the ACT structures its content, and the content, their standards is they incorporate rigor into their standard alignments. And going back to the first bullet point, none of those lower level rigor items or standards are out on any of the sections. And so you're still going to see some of the more foundational topics, the 201s, the 301s showing up on the test. So yeah, what we're seeing in the sample test is it looks more like there's been reduction across the spectrum, and not just, like you said, sample to the front. Or if you had the reverse idea and thinking like, woohoo, those last 15 are just like chopped off. Like that's not what they did either. It's definitely interspersed. So the next one I want to talk about is actually it's connected, is the difficulty of the test. The test is easier, or again, the test is harder. This is an easy misconception, probably one of the easiest misconceptions, because when you look at the way the test is structured, there's fewer questions, there's more time afforded to the students, the passages are shorter. The interpretation is, hey, the test is going to be easier. But this is really not the case, because the ACT is a norm reference test, which means that even though well, Craig, kind of curious your take. Like, explain in your best take, your best chance you can, in simple common language, what would be a norm reference test?
What it means is that the test is going to the enhanced ACT test and its scoring curve and what it's saying is calibrated the same way as the former version of the test, right? And so it goes back to this concept that subjectively the student will experience, they might feel a little different while they take the test, right? They might feel like, oh, I had a little bit more time, I had a little more breathing room, there was less, it was less demanding in certain ways, right? But it's more demanding in other ways, right? Because again, each question is worth more. And this test is still going to differentiate between student ability levels in the same way as it has in the past, which is part of why so many colleges and institutions and states rely on the data. It's still going to be a reliable indicator there. And it means that on average, right, let's say, because this is a question administrators might have or educators might have, if all of my students took the former version of the test, and then all my students again take the new version of the test without any other things happening, without any other learning, without any other preparation, you're going to have uh, a very similar score distribution. You're not going to magically have more students meeting the college ready benchmark. You're not going to magically have less students meeting the college ready benchmark. There might be little shifts among individual students because it might highlight their strengths and weaknesses slightly differently. But the tests are calibrated together. And so anyway, I don't know if I satisfied your plain English or short requirements there for your question, Oliver, but I gave it my best shot.
It was pretty close. And I think like one of the ways, and this is maybe oversimplification, it's a bell curve essentially, right? So you're looking at a bell curve as a bell curve. And so there's in general that distribution is the same. So a 30 on the math, it's going to be a 30 in the math from test to test, just because of the nature of how it's structured. There's a question from the audience, which is, I think, maybe a good point to point out here because we're talking about the structure of the test and how it's scored and everything. But the question is from David there. It says, where can we find examples of the new test for students and or teachers to reference for ACT prep? So if you go to act.org or, do Google search for their enhanced test, they have a sample practice test available there right now. It is a digital format, but you can pull that up and see how like the online test works. It even has some of the same tools that you're going to see in the real test. That is a good starting point, and that test is a great research item. We looked at ourselves and definitely recommend that you start there. We'll talk a bit too because we also at Mastery Prep offer practice testing in the new form for enhanced test, the enhanced test, and that's another place where we can talk about. We have samples, we have a lot of information that we can share about that as well. And Craig, do you want to add anything to our side of the equation?
I am adding a link in the chat that if you click there and you scroll down a bit, you'll see full-length practice tests, um, timed and untimed versions of the online practice tests in the new format. So straight from
Cool.
AC.
Perfect. All right, let's go to the last misconception here, which is paper and pencil is going away. So this is a really easy one to answer. So the ACT has added this online experience. They've revamped what they're offering. It's really easy to interpret that to mean paper and pencil is gone, but it will be a choice. So there will be a computer version of the test, an online version of the ACT, and then there will be a paper and pencil version available. So you're not going to lose access to that with again the caveat that it is a choice. It may not be your choice depending on what your state or district or school has decided. So let's talk a bit
That's
about
a
our
that's a major
oh,
differentiator between ACT and the digital SAT, right? So, the students being able to do paper and pencil, regardless of whether they have accommodations or not, is a strength that ACT has over the SAT. It's one additional choice that students and their parents can make if you're going the ACT route.
yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to why start early. So I think I'll just jump right into our timeline. But basically, Craig has mentioned a few times we're a big believer in starting early. You can't wait till spring 2026 to start getting your plan in shape. So let's talk about the timeline and some of the changes happening here. And so, we're pretty much hitting that bullet point right there, which is after the spring test date. That's essentially happened at the stage. And so this is the time when you're going to want to start talking to your students and your administration, your teachers, about what's happening. Reason being is that if we wait until we're in the throes of the school year, people are getting onboarded. You're running through all your different professional development actions. You know how easy it is for things to slip, and so we want to have a plan now about how we're going to communicate that out. And then over the summer, that is the point where you should start putting together your actual implementation plan for how you're going to tackle the enhanced ACT, so that when you hit the fall, you hit the ground running. You should be having, like I said in the bullet point here, a full scale plan. Because one of the benefits of ACT preparation in a school context is that you have access to the students longer than any test prep program, anyone out there, any paid service or tutoring. You're going to see the students every single day throughout the school year. And if you have the plan in place to talk to them about the enhanced ACT, you're going to make the biggest impact on their results in the spring. And again, that being the ultimate target point for the preparation, spring 2026. And Jordan just dropped in the chat a detailed timeline. We have a blog about this that goes into more details here, but I think that in general, you get the basic sense of like, hey, get it out as soon as you can. Summertime is a great time for setting the groundwork so that we're ready to go in the fall. Melanie had a question, which is, are colleges accepting scores from the new version of the test, or should I encourage upcoming seniors to take the current test? It's an interesting question, Craig. What's your general advice there? I
The
guess
one is,
there's an acceptance question, but
they're accepting both. And I would strongly recommend that your students, if they're able to in this window, experience both versions, right? Because there might be a small difference in how they perform on one test or the other at the individual level. So if they have the option, if they've already submitted and they've already taken the former version of the ACT, and they have the opportunity to do an enhanced ACT administration, strongly recommend that they do that.
yeah, absolutely. So let's go on to our strategies. So this is a kind of the main thing we wanted to hit in the webinar, is talking about how are you going to actually bring this information to bear in the classroom setting. So the test has changed, and we're going to highlight some of the things that are changed. There's a lot of things that are also carried over that we want to make sure you're thinking about when you go into your prep. The first thing we want to talk about is English. Now, the English test, I mentioned already that there's a shortening to the passages. But one of the things that we didn't talk about is that the English is introducing a new structure, which is they're adding a question stem to all of the questions on the test. So if you're like, what does that mean? You can look at the example here on the screen. Question number one there's no question that's asked for this of the students. It's just choices. And in some ways, that can be clear because you don't get distracted by the stem. But in some ways, it's unclear because you don't know what they really want you to do. So what ACT has done is they've added a stem to all questions. So there's never going to be a question that looks like on the left there. It's going to be on the right. For example, this one is, which choice makes the sentence most grammatically acceptable? That's kind of implied by that first question, but now it's explicit, which is really good. It's clear for the student. The catch, though, is because there's all these new stems, there's a need for you to familiarize your students with them. So one of the things that we recommend is that you show them an English test, you show them the new stems, and so they can get used to that language. And that way students aren't having to decode on the fly in the middle of the test. Like, they have that familiarity with the question stem.
It also
And
it also creates um, a elevated or high importance subset of academic vocabulary, right? Like the words that are appearing in the stems are words that your students should understand what they mean. And I know that that sounds basic, and in this example, grammatically acceptable, we hope the student knows what that means. But in each test, and in any test, there are academic vocabulary words that are highlighted, and it's a real opportunity to make sure that the students have mastered the understanding of those terms and can really understand what's being asked of them. There's terms like concise might go over the student's head. And you go from having a STEM that really helps the student to one that confuses them just because of their mastery of the academic vocabulary that's involved.
yeah, it's a really great point. And there's a lot of new stems. It's not just the one here that we're showing. So I think that getting that increased vocabulary is really huge. The other thing I wanted to highlight with English is that when you look at the standard distribution and how the reporting categories are broken out in the test, grammar, especially foundations of grammar like punctuation, verb tense, these things are really, really important to the English, and they're also a great like quick win for students. So if you're thinking about how you want to approach getting students to improve in the English, some of those foundational topics are like really ripe for the picking, partly because they don't really hear much about that in high school curriculum typically. It's usually something that's more covered in middle school. And so we always emphasize that if you're going to go after English scores, especially systemically in your school, doing things like comma boot camps or punctuation, boot camps can be really, really beneficial to the students' results. So let's talk a bit about the math. So the math is undergoing some pretty significant changes as well. I wanted to highlight a couple of points and then we can talk about some strategy here. First thing about the math is that, and I think you can see right on the screen, is that we're going to see fewer choices on the question. So we were going from 5 choices to 4 choices. Previously, math was the only section with 5 choices, but now it has been brought in line with everything else, and you're going to see 4 choices for each of the math questions. You'll also notice that, on the left, we have a word problem. On the right, we have kind of more of a plug and chug style question. Uh, Word problems are not gone from the new ACT, but they've been reduced. There's been a bigger emphasis on what we like to call precision questions, questions that require, doing a lot of calculations and like really, kind of straight to the math, so to speak. And so those two changes have like a ripple effect on how we want to think about the test. And so I want to talk, Craig, I want your thoughts on especially the precision component, like the time limits, the emphasis there, like how does it affect how students approach the math?
So I think for one is it becomes even more important that students master, and this isn't really a test taking skill. This is really a math skill of, you know, strong math students know how to confirm that they've arrived at the right answer. And they know how to do that by having another solution pathway with the answer that they have. And so because you have a little more time, that means that there's even more per question. That means there's even more opportunity to exercise that skill. And it's always more straightforward to do that with a mathy type question versus a word problem type question. There are also going to be fewer, word problems are one of the areas where we can assess students on multiple skills and the integration of skills. And so that means that there are going to be fewer multi-step, multi-discipline questions. And it's going to be really important that students have a clean mastery of the core skills, the algebra, the geometry. Ultimately, yes, time management is important, test taking is important, but ultimately, this is an assessment of what students have learned of their act. It's why the ACT is such an important and valuable assessment. It's an assessment of what the student has mastered through their high school and to some degree some of their middle school career. And the test is going to put that on full display. So it's just really important that students have that mastery, but it's also important that they have that ability to check. Every question is worth a little more, contributes a little more towards your score because there's less questions. They really need to not miss that point because they dropped a negative, for example. That can be a really, really brutal thing that happens.
Absolutely. That's really good. So let's talk a bit about the reading and science. So I want to hit the reading next. So we mentioned earlier and actually showed a passage that we have shorter passages on the reading, but we also have a little more time and there are fewer questions per passage. So we're going from 10 per passage to 9 questions per passage. So the net result is there's a little bit more room for like actually paying attention to the passage itself. And so you see a lot of advice out there, and I've been in the test prep industry for I guess 20 years now, and I've worked as a tutor, I've worked all as a teacher, all the different elements. You see a lot of advice around don't focus on reading because you don't have time to read the passage. You just should go right to the questions. And this is really, we never believed in that at Master Prep. We've always felt like you need to read the passage. It's a core part of like how you approach the exam. There's strategies around it, and there's reading techniques. We've always believed that, but that's even more true than ever now because we have shorter passage with more time. it gives students a chance to actually lay a groundwork understanding what's happening before they dive into the questions. Uh, so, that's one of the big impacts. We also want to highlight that when you're answering the question in the reading, this is an open book test. And in MasteryPrep, we talk about all the time, this is an open book test. It's actually a different skill than reading and understanding like a novel and having a test 3 weeks later, right? This is an open book, passage-based exam. So it's a skill for students to learn how to go back to the passage and find what they need. And that's what's being tested on the ACT. Now there's a little more time. There's fewer questions. The passages are shorter. That ability to go back and pull information from the passage is going to be even more important and even more useful on the reading test. So, uh, Craig, you want any other commentary on that? I know you're a big fan of reading. It's like your favorite section, right?
Well, it's called the reading test. It's not called the skimming test, right? Like it's the concept of, can a student read a passage, understand it, answer questions, and support their answers, right? So, ideally what the student's doing is they read the passage, not leisurely, but there's time to read it and comprehend it, and then they answer questions. And as they're answering questions, they're referring back to the passage, right? And because there's a little more time, there's more time to refer, and there's more time to do that first read through well, and there's also more time to refer back and check your work and make sure that and use the process of elimination, use what you've learned about supporting your answers with evidence through your classroom activities to actually arrive at the best answer and the answer that you have the most confidence in.
Yeah, and I think I want to point out two things about that, and then we'll move on to science. I know that everyone's excited to see science changes too. But one thing I want to point out is that students' tendencies is to not look back at the passage. Like once they finish reading, they want to just answer the questions, usually in sequential order. So we really want to encourage them to go back to the passage. Part of the reason why they don't want to go back is because they feel the pressure. So this is an opportunity, like again, mentioning those margins for the students who felt that pressure. There might be a little less pressure on moving quickly and a little bit more room to justify going back. So if you've had trouble getting students to adopt the mentality of looking back at the passage, this is a great like excuse to kind of like transition back to that as a habit. So, and the other thing I wanted to mention too is that I will say that even though we agree, we are on the same page about reading the passage first. Just like I said, with the 18% bump in time, there is a bump in time here, but it isn't triple the time. So you don't want to fall into the trap of overdoing uh, some of these time sync things like reading a passage. So there's a balance to work on, and it's an important skill to practice. The last section, we'll talk about the science. So the science section is also getting some changes. One of the things that uh, we're seeing in the science is that there was a time period. I'm blanking how many years ago. I want to say like 9 or 10 years ago, where the test had 7 passages and it bumped down to 6. Well, it's bumping back to 7 passages. It's adding time to compensate for that, but there is an additional passage added, um, and the topic. There's also going to be an addition of a topic to that. So that passage essentially, the way you can kind of conceptualize, they're adding a 7th passage with a focus on design and engineering, and so this is the main change in it. But again, because they're adding passages, they're adding time, and the net result is the number of questions is not increasing, but the time is increasing. And so we're getting slightly changed pacing approach in the science. And so Craig, I'm curious your take on the change and it's kind of a nuance, a little more time, but an extra passage. How does that play out for students?
Well, and I think there was a time long ago and far away where the science test had 7 passages, and then we moved to the 6 passage format. And so I think um, it's not a radical change, but it does mean that having that extra passage does change the even with the extra time, just changes the calculus a little bit of how long you should spend on each of the passages. We One kind of shorthand we introduced to students is we really want them to think about the science test not as one big test, but as now 7 little miniature tests that they need to allocate. They need to be their own proctor and allocate a amount. If they spend all their time on 6 passages and never get to that 7th passage, there's no way they're going to answer it correctly. So they really have to be their own proctor and spend a set amount of time with each passage and be disciplined about that. We call that pace, so that they give each passage its fair shake, because they're going to be able to answer questions in each and every one of those passages.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's talk about what MasteryPrep is up to. So obviously, like we've been working on our updates for enhanced ACT for basically almost a year at this point. And when there's been a lot of changes, and I wanted to highlight them. And again, Craig, happy to hear your thoughts on this too. The first change that we're going to talk about is the digital improvement. So, as you know, because of the ACT's changes, the test is changing, which means that we have to make updates to our testing, our analysis. We had to introduce field testing. There's a lot of changes, but we went through an approach of like, not just updating for enhanced ACT. We wanted to really have like a full improvement to our platform experience. We're adding a lot of reporting that's going to enable you to do more alignments between the ACT and your state standards. We're adding tools to match some of the tools that we're seeing in the ACT. So, for example, there'll be a highlighter tool, an embedded calculator. We didn't just want to just make updates to the content. We wanted the experience to be an overall improved experience and more in line with what it's like to take a computer-based ACT test. That said, as we mentioned all throughout the session, we've also updated our entire strategy line. So everything about our pacing, all the strategy we talked about today and more, that's all been updated in all of our materials. So our print curriculum, our professional development that we do for teachers and administrators, the events that we do for students, the platform strategies have all been updated for the new structure of the ACT. And then finally, one of the things, probably the biggest change that you're going to see across all of our materials and across everything we do is every single one of our questions has been updated to the new ACT format. So all of our math questions are reduced down to 5. We've added question stems. All the passages have been shortened. So there's been a massive effort on our end. It's been months of work to do this the right way, and make all these updates and changes. So the net result is if our entire product line for ACT has been completely updated for this new enhanced ACT, which reflects everything we've been talking about in today's session. And then, Craig, I don't know, Craig, do you want to add any color commentary to that?
Well, I think it's a lot of effort has gone into completely updating our program so that there's not any disconnect between what your students are experiencing day to day in the classroom and what they're going to experience on test day. We don't want them to have to decode or change what we're telling them about the time or change what they're seeing, right? And it's just really important. We believe that when you're providing preparation for students, that you actually get as close as you can to what they're going to be experiencing. Like that's the best way for the students to learn. And so, they shouldn't first see English question stems when they take the test, right? If you're using a Mastery Prep program, you can rest assured knowing that you can be certain that this is actually similar to what my students are going to be experiencing on test day without you having to short story is if you're already a Mastery Prep customer and you're already using Mastery Prep programs, this is going to be a pretty effortless transition for you because all of the resources will be exactly in line with what we've been talking about today and with what's happening in the assessments.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. And that's a really great point. At the end of the day, we got it covered, right? Like that's kind of the big picture. Which brings you to the last thing I wanted to hit in terms of our update. So I mentioned this a couple different times, but I think that it's in the spirit of starting early, in the spirit of getting your school and district ready, and or yourself if you're a teacher or an educator. We believe really strongly in having a professional development baseline, and so we have updated our professional development. Is one of the first things we updated for the new exam. So we have a new release. It's called the MasteryPrep Unofficial Teacher's Guide to the ACT. It is a fully baked out professional development for the new test, for the changes. It includes the rebalanced frequency tables that I mentioned for the reporting categories. It goes through all the new question types and strategies, talks about the online test, the features. It's a big change. Honestly, kind of like one of the coolest things we do at MasteryPrep is we don't just put you in front of a product. Like we want to train educators on what's actually happening, how to implement this in your classroom, your day to day. And so this is our biggest update is out now. It's available. We are encouraging all of our customers, current customers, and future customers to start early by picking up professional development and running that through ideally through your summer in-service days. Craig, this is one book you've had a really heavy hand in, so I know it's kind of your baby. Do you want to talk a bit more about it?
Yeah, certainly. Just in terms of school, like investments that schools and school districts can make to improve outcomes on college readiness through the entire system, through the entire campus, through the entire district. Professional development is the highest impact way that we've seen to do that because and really it comes down to this is like we mentioned earlier, ultimately this is a test of what students know, of what they've mastered. And it can be transformative for a school or district if a teacher really knows, really understands what's being assessed, how it's being assessed, and is able to align that with what they're doing in the classroom, then they're able to ensure that students reach that level of rigor that is going to be assessed, that the student is actually going to need when they go into a a college environment. And so, and then you see scores increase, not because you've, done any kind of crazy test prep, but because you've generated alignment. So, the professional development, not only does it catch everyone up on what the changes are, but really helps educators understand what are the challenges, what do, how do we really need to align? How can we create a college going campus, a college going culture on our campus? And definitely makes for some good summer programming.
Yeah, and you'll see Jordan drop some links in the chat. Again, I'm a maybe a biased guy. I'm head of product and I work really closely with the development team. I would recommend that you, of all those links, click on that professional development for the enhanced ACT link. Check it out, see what's there, because this is a really interesting, fun time in ACT prep when you care a lot about it. But when you're a school with 1,000 other problems, you really want to get this knocked out and not have to figure it out on your own. So please check that out. Really appreciate y'all being a part of that. And we've got some time now for some questions. There are a few extra questions that have come in. So Jordan, I think you're going to run that for us.
Yes, thank you both, first of all, for sharing those insights. We did get a few more questions in the live chat. The first one is, can I still use materials that aren't updated for the enhanced ACT to prepare my students?
I'll take that one. So on one level, you can, in the sense that, like we discussed, the core skills and knowledge that are being tested, the standards haven't changed, although the frequency with which some of those things are being assessed has changed, the weight. Um, that said, um, if you're using materials that aren't updated, then you're orienting your students towards question types and formats of questions and time limits and all these things that are not exactly what a student will face. So it's sort of like teaching a parachute class, but like they're going to have a parachute twice as big as what they're actually going to be jumping out of the plane with, right? Like they'll probably be fine. They're just pulling the ripcord, but it definitely doesn't fully prepare the student for that experience. So we strongly recommend that if you're orienting towards a spring 2026 test date, that you use updated resources, and that you actually, one thing is you've got to be able to check for uh, just because a resource says it's updated for the ACT, for the enhanced ACT, like let's say you find something in a bookstore, you find something online and they have it updated for the enhanced ACT, that takes 3 seconds to put that on a product, right? Like we recommend take a look at that resource, look at the practice questions, look at the passage links, look at their prior year version and verify that that an update really has occurred and it's preparing your student for the new test.
Yeah, and I'll throw 2 cents on that, and I think that Craig's being pretty diplomatic about it. I think that you really want to use updated materials because there's a psychological effect when you're a student and you sit down and take a test, and if it's even a little different, if it just looks off, it doesn't have, there's question stems, there's a different structure, it's fewer questions. It can really throw you off like the mental game of taking an exam. And if you ever heard of like test anxiety or students who have like nerves around those kinds of things, a lot of that even comes from just like knowing the enemy, so to speak, and the enemy is the wrong term, but like knowing the test assessment, like what it's trying to get out of you, like knowing the challenge in front of you. And so, and that's what the ACT wants too. They want you to have a fair assessment of your skills. And so it's important that they're getting that experience. So like I want to echo what Craig says, maybe like even a little harder push.
Great. Thank you both. One more question, if we could answer this one quickly. How does the enhanced ACT compare with the new digital SAT?
So I'll kick that one off, and Craig, I know you have some thoughts on that for sure. So, the tests are still fairly different. The current version of the SAT, the SAT changed, several years ago, it made a pretty marked departure from the structure that it had been using. So it got rid of long passages and went down to short passages, like paragraph long passages. It made some other pretty significant changes to its organization and structure. When it did that, it distanced itself decently from ACT in terms of like format. There's a lot of shared content, a lot of overlap there, but the format was pretty different. What's interesting about the ACT's decision of how they went online, they did not make as much of a departure to the format. There's been some smaller changes. So I would say that if you're familiar with the SAT and ACT's sort of like gulf, that gulf really still exists. The biggest difference is that now the ACT has an online component with some additional tools. But in general, in terms of like the length of passages, the number of questions, rigor of questions, it's just a very different strategy in terms of how the test is structured. But again, Craig, I'm curious your take on that.
Well, I think a couple other items are one is in the scoring, half of your overall SAT score comes from math, whereas on the ACT, one third comes from math. That's a material difference, right? And something to factor in. I think that another market difference is, as Oliver alluded to, ACT's passages are getting a little shorter, but it's still one passage per 9 questions versus the digital SAT now for reading comprehension does small passages, like micro passages, and they're related questions. You get a tiny passage and a question. There's some people say, oh, it's not a longer passage, so maybe this is better for my students who are challenged in reading. That's not necessarily the case, right? Because when you have a short passage and then you're context switching to another short passage and you're context switching to another short passage, you have a lot more concepts that the student has to understand and try to figure out within the time limit. Whereas a student who might be challenged with reading, they have a longer passage, he has to like, oh my goodness, this is a wall of text. But they've only got to get that and the overall concept once. There's only if there's 4 passages, there's only 4 main ideas for those passages. If there's 20 different passages, each of those has their own concept and main ideas. So it's just different, but it is a material difference. If you're preparing your student for the digital SAT, you're not having them grok those long passages. You're working on those smaller bits. So I do think that the digital SAT had moved away from word problems and ACTs and has more of the kind of pure math type questions. And you're seeing that ACT. So one similarity is ACT is shifting a little bit more in that direction as well. If we want to have differences and similarities in this discussion, but I would call out the biggest things are one, the scoring difference. SAT's half math versus one third math with ACT and the passage formats, which we discussed. And ACT, there's a pencil and paper option. Digital SAT is pure adaptive. And I guess I'm missaying the most obvious thing is the digital SAT is an adaptive test. So when the students complete their first module, then their experience changes for that second module. And whereas with ACT, everyone's taking the same form.
Right.
Great. I think we're at time, but thank you again, Craig and Oliver, for your insights, and thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone for attending our webinar. I've also added some links with more information in the chat, so be sure to check those out. And we'll be sharing the webinar recording via email in the next few days for easy access. In the meantime, feel free to visit our website, masteryprep.com, to contact us directly and learn more about our ACT offerings. And we'll also be hosting a few more deeper dive webinars in the fall, so stay tuned for more information on those. And in the meantime, be sure to check out our blog, follow us on LinkedIn for company updates, and information about standardized testing and test prep. Thanks again for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.